I remember the moment I died. It wasn't dramatic. There were no final words or anyone calling my name. It was quiet, almost insignificant, like the world had already decided I didn't matter long before I disappeared from it. And then I opened my eyes. At first I thought I was dreaming. The soft rustle of silk curtains, the faint golden patterns across the ceiling, the delicate scent of roses in the air, it all felt too unreal, too distant from the life I remembered. This wasn't my room. This wasn't my world. I slowly sat up, a strange unease settling deep in my chest. Something felt wrong, and I didn't even know why yet. My gaze drifted toward the mirror across the room, almost as if something was pulling me toward it. And when I finally saw my reflection, my breath caught. The face staring back at me was beautiful in a way that felt almost untouchable. Elegant, sharp, cold, not mine. But I knew that face. It wasn't a stranger's reflection staring back at me. It was hers. The villainess. The one everyone hated. The one who stood in the way of the heroine. The one whose downfall was inevitable and whose ending was anything but kind. A chill ran through me as the realization settled in fully. I hadn't just entered a story, I had become the one character no one ever rooted for. And I knew exactly how her story ended. It wasn't quick. It wasn't merciful. It was the kind of ending designed to satisfy slow, humiliating, and absolute. She lost everything, piece by piece, betrayed by those around her, until there was nothing left but the consequences of a life no one ever tried to understand, and in the end executed. My fingers tightened slightly at the thought. No matter how I looked at it, there was no version of that ending I could accept. This can't be how it ends for me. I turned away from the mirror, trying to steady my thoughts, but they were already racing ahead. I knew this story. Not every small detail, but enough to understand the structure, the key events, and the outcome. Which meant I also understood something far more terrifying. This world wasn't designed to save someone like me. For a brief moment, a simple idea crossed my mind. What if I just changed? What if I avoided the mistakes the original Villainess made? If I stayed quiet, acted kind, kept my distance from the main characters, could I escape that fate? It was a comforting thought. Too comforting. Because the more I thought about it, the more I realized how naive it was. The Villainess didn't fall only because of her actions. Long before the story even reached its climax, she had already lost the things that mattered to trust, allies, and control over her own narrative. In a world like this, reputation wasn't just perception, it was power, and hers had already been shattered. She was meant to lose not because she couldn't change, but because no one was willing to see her differently. Which meant even if I did nothing, I would still end up the same way. That realization settled heavily in my chest, but instead of panic, something colder took its place. This wasn't a story where kindness could rewrite fate. This was a story where survival required control. I slowly looked back at my reflection. If the world already saw me as the Villainess, then trying to prove otherwise might be the biggest mistake I could make. Because in a story like this, playing nice doesn't change your fate. It just makes you easier to destroy. A slow breath left my lips as my thoughts finally aligned into something solid. I didn't need to be liked, I needed to survive. And survival meant having control, having information, and knowing exactly when to act. If I wanted to live, I needed to use everything I knew about this story, not the romance, not the drama, but the events that actually shaped the world behind it. And that's when I understood what truly mattered. It wasn't the prince or the heroine, it was the war. My entire body stilled as the memory surfaced more clearly. In the novel, the war wasn't the main focus. It was treated like a background event, something that made the hero shine brighter. The kingdom was attacked, a brutal conflict broke out, and in the end they won. That's all the story cared about victory. But that was never the whole truth. There was something it barely acknowledged, something it brushed aside as if it didn't matter. My territory, my lands were the first to fall, not partially damaged or easily rebuilt, but completely destroyed, invaded, burned, and reduced to nothing long before the kingdom secured its victory. By the time anyone reacted, it was already too late. And the villainess, she never saw it coming. Her downfall didn't start with betrayal or execution. It started there, with that war. I walked slowly toward the window, pulling the curtain aside. Outside, everything looked peaceful, untouched, almost deceptively calm. There was no sign of the destruction I knew was coming, no hint that this entire land was standing on the edge of collapse. But I knew, and that changed everything. Because this wasn't just information anymore. It was an opportunity. If I could prevent my territory from being destroyed, then I wouldn't just survive. I would hold power, resources, influence, enough to change the outcome that was supposed to crush me. For the first time since I woke up in this world, I felt something shift inside me, not fear, not confusion, but control. This was where my story truly began, not at the end everyone remembered, but here in a moment no one else thought mattered. The only problem was no one would believe me. A noble lady predicting war without proof would sound ridiculous at best and suspicious at worst. And in a world like this, suspicion was dangerous. One wrong move, one poorly timed word, and I could draw attention I wasn't ready to handle. So simply knowing the future wasn't enough. I needed someone who could act on it. Someone powerful enough to move armies. Someone who didn't care about rumors or reputation. A name surfaced in my mind almost instantly, and the moment it did, a faint, knowing smile touched my lips. Because if there was anyone in this world who valued results over appearances, it was him, and if I wanted to survive this story, he had to be my first move. I couldn't rely on the prince or the court. They were bound by politics, by appearances, by hesitation, and in a situation like this, hesitation was no different from failure. I needed someone who could act without waiting for permission, someone who valued results over reputation, someone who wouldn't dismiss the truth simply because it came from the wrong person. In this story, there was only one man like that, the Duke. Even in the original novel, he stood apart from everyone else. He wasn't involved in the usual power struggles, didn't chase influence through alliances, and had no interest in pleasing others. People called him cold, but that wasn't what made him dangerous. What made him dangerous was that he was practical. He didn't care who you were, only what you could offer. Which meant if I wanted his help, I couldn't rely on status or persuasion. I needed leverage. The moment I stepped into his estate, the difference was impossible to ignore. The capital thrived on performance, carefully chosen words, polite smiles, and conversations layered with hidden intent. But here everything felt stripped down to its purpose. There was no unnecessary decoration, no effort to impress. Just order, control, and quiet authority. It made one thing clear. This was not a place where empty words held value. By the time I was led into his office, I had already prepared myself for rejection. Still, the reality of facing him was something else entirely. He didn't stand when I entered, didn't offer even the smallest courtesy. His attention shifted to me only after a brief pause, as if acknowledging my presence was a decision rather than a reflex. For a moment, the silence stretched between us, and I understood instinctively that this was not accidental. He was watching, measuring, waiting to see how I would handle it. "So," he said at last, his tone calm and unhurried, "what brings you here?" There was no hostility in his voice, but there was no warmth either. Just quiet indifference, as if my answer would determine whether this conversation was worth continuing at all. "I need your help," I said. He didn't react. No curiosity, no dismissal, just stillness. It was the kind of response that made it clear those words alone meant nothing to him. So I gave him something that would. "There's going to be a war." That got his attention, if only slightly. His gaze sharpened, not with surprise, but with interest, like someone hearing an unexpected claim and deciding whether it was worth examining or discarding. "A war," he repeated, the words measured. "And what makes you so certain?" "I know enough," I replied, keeping my tone steady. "Enough to tell you where the first movements will happen, where the scouts will appear, and how this will unfold before the rest of the kingdom even realizes what's coming." For a brief moment he said nothing, and I could feel the shift in the air, not belief, not yet, but evaluation. He wasn't dismissing me outright anymore. He was thinking. That was enough. "You expect me to act on that?" he asked. "No," I said calmly. "I expect you to verify it." That was the first real change. It was subtle, almost invisible, but I saw it clearly. I wasn't asking for trust, I was offering something testable, something real. And for someone like him, that mattered far more than confidence or persuasion. But even that wasn't enough to secure his interest. So I raised the stakes. "If I'm wrong," I said, holding his gaze without hesitation, "I'll give you half of my fortune." This time the silence that followed was different. It carried weight. The kind that comes when a conversation stops being theoretical and becomes something tangible. "Half your fortune," he repeated, slower this time, as if weighing the words. I nodded. "Yes." His gaze lingered on me. "No conditions?" "None." He studied me carefully, as if expecting the slightest sign of uncertainty. But there was nothing to find. I had already committed to this the moment I decided to come here. Doubt wouldn't help me now. "You understand what you're offering," he said. "I do." "And you're willing to risk that on this claim?" "I'm not risking it," I replied. "I'm proving it." That was the moment something shifted. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but I saw it. The exact second he stopped seeing this as a waste of time and started seeing it as an opportunity. From his perspective, this wasn't a gamble. It was a win either way. If I was right, he gained information that could give him an advantage before anyone else even reacted. And if I was wrong, he gained half my fortune without effort. There was no reason for him to refuse. "Very well," he said after a brief pause. "I'll entertain this." It wasn't trust. It wasn't agreement. Just interest. "If your information proves correct," he continued, "then we proceed further. And if it doesn't?" His gaze held mine, steady and unyielding. "Then I collect what you promised." Simple, direct, unforgiving. Exactly what I needed, because belief was never the goal. Not yet. All I needed was for him to look, to check, to see it for himself, because the moment that happened, everything would change. And as I turned to leave, I could still feel his gaze on me, sharp and calculating, as if trying to decide what kind of person would make a gamble like this without hesitation. He didn't trust me, not even close. But that didn't matter, because soon he wouldn't have a choice. Still, as I stepped out of his estate, the weight of what I'd done finally settled in. Words had been easy. Certainty had been easy. Now everything depended on one thing, whether I was right. And for the first time since I woke up in this world, a quiet doubt slipped in. Not because I didn't trust my memory, but because memory was the same as control. The story I had read wasn't a perfect map. It didn't account for small changes, for delays, for the way reality could shift in ways no one noticed until it was too late. If I had misremembered even one detail, if the timing was even slightly off, then everything I had just risked would collapse. And worse than losing my fortune, I would lose the only chance I had to change what was coming. Still, there was no turning back now. The next few days passed more slowly than I expected. On the surface, everything remained calm. The capital continued as it always did, untouched by the tension building just beneath it. No signs of unrest, no whispers of conflict, nothing that would make anyone believe a war was approaching, which made the silence even more suffocating, because I knew what was supposed to happen. And every hour that passed without it made me question myself just a little more. Had I been too early? Had I misunderstood something? Or worse, had I been wrong? By the third day, even I started to feel the pressure of it. Not outwardly, I didn't allow that, but internally, the certainty I had relied on began to crack at the edges. It was a dangerous feeling, one that crept in quietly and settled deep enough to be hard to ignore. And then, on the fourth day, everything changed. The report came in just before noon. Enemy scouts had been sighted near the outer borders, exactly where I said they would be. For a moment, the words didn't feel real, not because I doubted them, but because of what they meant. The uncertainty that had been building for days disappeared in an instant, replaced by something far steadier. Relief. Not the kind that made me relax, but the kind that sharpened everything. Because this wasn't just confirmation. It was proof. And proof, in a world like this, changed everything. I didn't wait. By the time I returned to his estate, the atmosphere had shifted. Not dramatically, not enough for most people to notice it, but it was there. Subtle, controlled urgency beneath the surface. This time I wasn't made to wait as long. When I entered the room, he was already aware. I could tell from the way his attention fixed on me immediately, from the absence of indifference that had defined our first meeting. "You were right," he said. No greeting, no pretense, just acknowledgement. For a brief moment I let that settle, not as satisfaction, but as confirmation of something more important. He was listening now. "Only the beginning," I replied. "The main force will follow soon." His gaze didn't leave mine, but it had changed. The doubt was still there, but it was no longer dominant. It had been replaced by something far more useful. Consideration. "Explain," he said. And this time I did. I told him everything I knew, not vaguely, not carefully, but with precision. The movement patterns, the timing, the way the enemy would test the borders before committing fully. I laid it out clearly, piece by piece, not as a guess, but as something that had already happened. He didn't interrupt, didn't question. He simply listened. And that, more than anything, told me how much had changed. By the time I finished, the silence that followed felt different from before. It wasn't doubt. It was calculation. "If this is accurate," he said slowly, "then they are not testing the borders." "No," I replied. "They are preparing to break them." A brief pause followed that, and for the first time I saw something shift in him that wasn't controlled. Interest. Not the shallow kind. The kind that comes when something exceeds expectation. "You're certain," he said. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." His gaze lingered on me, sharper now, as if trying to understand something that didn't quite fit into place. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. It was a simple question, but not an easy one. "Does it matter?" I replied. For a moment neither of us spoke, and then, "No," he said. But this time it meant something different. Not dismissal. Acceptance. He wasn't asking for an explanation anymore. He was choosing to move forward without one. And that was the real shift. Because trust wasn't built on answers. It was built on results. You mentioned strategy, he continued. If they move as you say, what would you suggest? That question changed everything, because now I wasn't just the one delivering information. I was part of the decision. I stepped closer, letting my focus settle fully. They are expecting resistance at the borders, I said. If you meet them there directly, you'll slow them but not stop them. You'll lose time, resources, and control. His attention sharpened further. Go on. Instead, I continued, pull back your outer defenses slightly. Not enough to look weak, but enough to make them think they are succeeding. Let them advance just far enough to commit their forces. He paused, not out of doubt, but in consideration, his gaze sharpening slightly. And then he asked. Cut them off, I said simply. From behind. Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It felt heavy, focused, as if the air itself had shifted. He wasn't just listening anymore, he was thinking it through, visualizing every step, testing the outcome before it even happened. You're suggesting we give up ground, he said. I'm suggesting you control where they fight, I corrected. That was the moment it clicked. I saw it in his expression, not dramatic or obvious, but unmistakable. Understanding settled in, followed by something more measured. Not full respect, not yet, but enough to change the way he looked at me. You thought this through, he said. Yes. He paused briefly, but this time it was decisive rather than doubtful. Then we'll test it. Just like that, the decision was made. There was no hesitation, no drawn-out debate. He accepted it, not blindly, but willingly. But it was enough to change what came next. He didn't question me again or dismiss my words as speculation. Instead, he turned back to the map and began giving orders. Scouts were reassigned. Messages were sent out immediately. Positions were adjusted with quiet precision, each command delivered without hesitation. He didn't wait for certainty, he acted on what he had. As I turned to leave, I could feel his attention on me again, no longer distant or dismissive, but focused, measuring. He said nothing, but this time he didn't need to. By the time I stepped out of the room, the shift was already in motion. It wasn't visible beyond his command, but it was there in every controlled movement, every order carried out without delay. And just like that, what I remembered as a distant event had already begun to unfold. The war had started. The days that followed were nothing like the quiet tension that came before. Reports arrived constantly, each one confirming another piece of what I had predicted. The enemy advanced exactly as expected, testing the borders, probing for weaknesses, moving with the same calculated rhythm I remembered. And each time he adapted, not blindly following my words, but using them, shaping them into something sharper, something more effective. Where the original story had described chaos and delayed responses, what I saw instead was control, deliberate positioning, measured retreats, calculated pressure. He didn't just react to the enemy. He anticipated them. At first, I remained at a distance, observing more than participating. It was safer that way, easier to maintain control without drawing too much attention. But distance, I realized quickly, was something he had no interest in maintaining. You'll be involved, he said one evening, his tone leaving little room for argument. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a decision. From that point on, I found myself drawn deeper into something I had only intended to influence from the edges. Strategy discussions replaced speculation, maps replaced memory, and what had once been knowledge from a story slowly became something far more immediate. Real. There was a difference between knowing what would happen and standing in the middle of it, watching each decision shape the outcome in real time. It demanded more focus, more precision, and far more control than I had anticipated. But I didn't step back. I couldn't, because every correct decision reinforced something important. I wasn't just following the story anymore. I was rewriting it, and somewhere in the middle of that shift, something else began to change. At first, it was subtle. A difference in the way he spoke to me, the way his attention lingered just a second longer than necessary. He didn't question my presence anymore, didn't treat me as someone temporary or expendable. He expected me to be there, and more than that, he relied on it. It wasn't obvious, not in the way most people would recognize. There were no unnecessary words, no attempts to soften his tone or make his intentions clear. But in moments where decisions mattered, where timing and accuracy determined everything, his gaze would find mine without hesitation, as if he already knew I would have an answer. It should have made things easier. In some ways it did, but it also created a tension I hadn't prepared for, because trust, even unspoken, had weight, and the more that weight settled between us, the harder it became to ignore something I had no intention of dealing with. One night, long after most of the estate had gone quiet, I found myself standing over a spread of maps, reviewing positions that had already been discussed twice that day. It wasn't necessary, but it kept my mind occupied, kept everything clear and controlled. Or at least it should have. You're overthinking it. His voice cut through the silence without warning. I didn't look up immediately. I prefer to be certain. You already are, he said. That made me pause. Slowly, I lifted my gaze to find him standing across from me, his expression as composed as ever, but his attention entirely focused. For someone who claims certainty, he continued, you spend a lot of time confirming it. And for someone who claims efficiency, I replied, you spend a lot of time observing things that don't concern you. A faint shift in his expression followed that, not quite amusement, but close enough to notice. It concerns me, he said. The words were simple, but the way he said them wasn't. For a moment, neither of us moved. The space between us felt different, no longer defined by strategy or necessity, but something quieter, less predictable, more dangerous. I turned my attention back to the map, more to steady my thoughts than out of necessity. The next movement will come from the eastern line, I said. They'll try to recover what they've already committed. And fail, he said. Yes. Another brief silence followed, but this time it didn't feel heavy. It felt settled, controlled. You've changed the outcome already, he said after a moment. I stilled slightly at that. Not because I disagreed, but because of what it meant. In the original story, this part had been chaos. Losses, delays, miscalculations that allowed the enemy to gain ground before the kingdom finally turned things around. It had been messy, uncertain, and costly. But this was different. Not yet, I said quietly. Only the beginning. His gaze remained on me, steady and unreadable. Most people wouldn't see it that way, he said. I'm not most people. That time, the shift in his expression was clearer. Not surprise. Recognition. And with it something else. Something I chose not to name, because naming it would make it real. And real things complicated everything. I'll have the final reports by morning, I said, stepping back slightly. You should rest. So should you, he said. I will. I didn't. Because even as everything fell into place, even as the strategy held and the outcome began to shift exactly as I intended, there was something I couldn't ignore anymore. This was no longer just about survival. And that was a problem. Because the more control I gained over the war, the less control I seemed to have over everything else. And as I finally allowed myself to step away, one thought lingered quietly, persistent enough that I couldn't push it aside. I had come here to change my fate, but somewhere along the way I might have changed his too, and I wasn't sure which of those would be more dangerous in the end.